What's up, guys? Welcome to part 2 of the Interpret and Apply series, where we are partnering with our friend Ryan Frederick from Fierce Marriage. Ryan, what's up, man? Thank you for joining us for part 2.
Absolutely. Hey, Ryan. I like your name.
We got to do something with that. You know, the Ryan and Ryan thing. It's gonna come up at some point.
And you kind of have your last name could also be a first name, and the same for my last name. So
that is very true. You know, we kind of have the same look here too. You know, the black shirt, the beard. I don't know, man. I was this close to putting on a black hat too, backwards.
that
would have been too much, man.
Too much.
All right, guys. So basically, with this series, as you know, if you've been watching Bibledingers, we are a Bible and theology show. So we sort of specialize in historical context. And so that's what we can give you. We can give you the historical background of these books, and we can also give you the interpretation of the passages. As far as application, we are suckers. And that is why we brought Ryan from Fierce Marriage on today, so that he can give you a little bit of more practical application of these verses. And so in part 2, we are drilling down on Proverbs 14:1. And so I'm just going to jump right on in and read it for you guys. It says, "The wisest of women builds her house, but folly with her own hands tears it down." So let me give you a little bit of the context around this. There's actually several authors of the book of Proverbs, and it was compiled together into one book. Chapter 14 specifically is within a portion of Proverbs written by Solomon. The portion is actually chapter 10 to chapter 22. Solomon wrote this portion of Proverbs probably in the middle of his reign as king, and that was from 971 to 931 BC. Solomon wrote 3 books of the Bible. He wrote Song of Solomon, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. Song of Solomon was thought to be his first book. Proverbs is thought to be written somewhere in the middle, and Ecclesiastes is thought to have been written towards the end of his reign as king. And so since this was likely written in the middle portion of his reign as king, which was again from 971 to 931 BC, it was likely written between 965 and 945 BC. And so a lot of the books of the Bible do have an original purpose as well as a purpose for you and I. And the Proverbs was written to give sort of practical wisdom to young readers. In general, they're short 2 to 3 line observations or exhortations about wise living. Proverbs were actually extremely common in that day. The book of Proverbs in the Bible is not the only place that you can find these wise sayings. You can read ancient proverbs from many religions and ancient texts. But the difference between those proverbs and the proverbs in the Bible is that the canonical book of Proverbs is obviously inspired by God and bases all of the wisdom in the book on the fear of the Lord. And so the sayings in this book should be taken as guidelines and not as absolute promises for every situation. That's important to keep in mind. In fact, many proverbs will note exceptions within the very text of the proverbs itself. And so what is stated in each proverb is generally and usually true of the situation. So let's hone in directly on Proverbs 14:1. So Proverbs is full of something called parallelism. This is a comparison or a contrast between the first and the second line of the proverb. Line A is good, but line B is bad. Line A is wise, but line B is foolish. And sort of the contrasting subset of parallelism in Proverbs is known as antithetical parallelism that is being used in this verse. And that just basically means that it contrasts things that are opposite. And that is what's happening in Proverbs 14:1. It's contrasting a wise woman and a foolish woman. So another thing to note, and this was the same in the Song of Solomon video, that this verse should not be taken hyper literally. It's not as if a wise woman physically builds houses with hammer and nails and DeWalt drill guns, and a foolish woman grabs a hammer and starts tearing it apart. That's not the case. It should be read more so like household. And so a wise woman proactively builds up her household, which would be her husband, her children. It's also the economics and responsibilities of the house. But a foolish woman either neglects to build up her home or is actively working against the building up of her household by negatively acting against her husband, children, and household responsibilities. And so I know, Ryan, your wife couldn't be here on this, but I wanted to see if I could kick it to you to talk about maybe some practical ways that we would see that played out. How would a foolish woman tear apart her household?
Yeah. Well, you have to go back to what you just described, the difference between wisdom and foolishness. And I love that you rooted the whole book of Proverbs and its canonical merit in the fact that it emphasizes the fear of the Lord, right?
Hmm.
That's at the very outset. Proverbs 1:7 is the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, at the beginning of wisdom. That is our very calibrating reality, right? It's not just a nice idea. Like, that is reality, that God is God. I am not.
Mm-hmm.
He sits on the throne. I do not. He makes the rules. He tells me what to do. I do not, right? And that I'm okay with that. Like, I'm okay with letting God be God, because I would make a horrible God, right? So if you think about contrasting wisdom and foolishness in the life of a wife or a husband, but we're talking about a wife right now, I think that the quickest way to tear down a house is just to be foolish in the biblical sense, to not fear the Lord, to not value the things of God the way He has shown us they are to be valued, but instead to somehow imbibe or to take in and internalize some other version of reality that is not centered on the fear of the Lord. And so many times that'll look like your whole value structure is rooted in something else. In our modern context, it's usually going to be career focused, outward appearance focused. It's going to be have some sort of personal actualization trajectory, and that's not the call we have as Christians. Our call as Christians is to glorify God and to be a living sacrifice unto Him, unto His glory, to the good of His people. So I think that's the first big way. Now, I love that you made the distinction between it's not just a house, physical house, but no, it's about the household. That idea,
Mm-hmm.
And building up a household is to be the joy and the glad privilege of a godly woman. I love that. And so, given how they could potentially tear it down, I think there are some really tangible ways in wisdom for her to build it up. And if it's okay, I'll just go into those, unless you want to chat a little bit.
Yeah, let's do it.
Well, I mean, again, I'm thinking through it, and again, I love how you've given the context and some of the interpretation of Proverbs, and that they're axiomatic pieces of wisdom, right? They're not absolute if this then that statements, but they're generally speaking, this is what wisdom looks like, and this is the fruit that wisdom bears, right? And so if we take that fear of the Lord line of thinking all the way through the book of Proverbs, we start to realize that because it's axiomatic descriptors, the very foundation of if we are to live out wisdom is going to come from that place of fearing the Lord. And if you don't know what fear of the Lord means, it's not being afraid of God per se. There is a sense that I'm afraid of God because He's God and I'm not. But no, it's this acknowledgement that you are God and I'm not. And that leads to, in Christ, a personal communion with God and a recognition of who God is and who I am as a result. And so the building up the household is the joy of the godly woman. But notice I didn't say it's building up the household is the duty of a godly woman. You could twist it to say that, and you could make it a prescription for godliness. Build up your house, therefore you are now godly. But instead, the author of the Proverbs is saying, a wise woman therefore builds up the house. It's a description of what a wise woman will naturally do. And I think that is the biggest pivot for a lot of wives to make. And we see that struggle happen in Proverbs 31 too, because a wife can read Proverbs 31, read the later part of that chapter as a to-do list. And if they do, it's crushing, right? Because this woman in Proverbs 31 is an unbelievably, remarkable woman. The things that she's able to accomplish. She's up all night, like doing the duties of a wife. It's crushing. But
Yes.
when you read it instead as a description of a woman who has experienced that personal communion with God, and the things that she's doing is an outflow of a heart that has been drawn near to Him, then it becomes something that is liberating, and it's not so crushing, but instead it's life-giving, right?
Mm.
So how a wife can build up her house, I think, will always come from the fount of that personal relationship with God, and from that same fount, it flows the nourishment for all other familial relationships, regardless of the context. That's the key too, because there's always going to be exceptions to this. And you asked the questions you asked this question in part one. Well, what if it's kind of asymmetrical? What if you've got one side that's not fulfilling their side of the agreement, so to speak? Does that determine how a wife should build up her house? And I would argue that if this is coming from that fount of knowing and being loved by God, then I'm going to build up my house in a godly way, regardless of how the house responds to me doing that, living out. So even the wife, in other words, even the wife of a foolish man can love him well as she finds herself and her identity and her security and her deepest joy in Christ, right?
Mm.
And I do want to say the caveat, will that be hard? Yeah, at times it'll be difficult. At times it'll feel like you're pushing a boulder uphill. But even in that struggle, it will be laced with the eternal hope of Christ, the eternal hope of God. So that's the foundation. And I think that's what wisdom is getting at. Like the wisest of women is one of the translations. It says the wisest of women builds her house. That's the foundation. And then from there, we can get into, okay, what is a house and what does it mean to build it? And that's what gets into the second one, which is husband. So clearly she's a wife. The fact that she's being identified as a wife delineates that there is a husband in the picture, and that becomes the clearest thing to talk through. And I think the clearest example I have for this is no one can encourage or deflate a man quite like his wife, right? So some of people who have heard our story and followed Fierce Marriage for any period of time, we wrote a book that talks about this event in our lives when we were first married. I got very sick. I had to have open heart surgery. I had a bacterial infection in my heart. We were overseas. We were in Switzerland, and they thought I was going to die. God's gracious, I didn't die, and I had to have open heart surgery. Well, after the surgery, I'm waking up, and as I'm waking up, I have these wires they're through. So if you take your rib cage, and right below your rib cage, you have your abs. Well, they stabbed holes through my stomach, up underneath my rib cage, underneath the skin. So it's underneath the skin, and it goes up over the clavicle and down into the heart. And they're these electrodes or wires, and then they're tied off with sutures. So there's 4 wires sticking out, going to various parts of my heart. And the reason for that was after they operated on my heart, they didn't know how I'm going to respond to medication or what's going to happen, as I'm waking up from anesthesia. And so having the wires there gave them a really quick way to jumpstart my heart. If it decided to stop beating, they could put me on basically a pacemaker and keep me alive. And that is a perfect analogy for the access a wife has to the heart of her husband. Right? At any moment, they could have hooked me up to a car battery and I would have been dead. Yeah. Or they could have used those wires to resuscitate me and bring life. And so a wife has access to her husband's heart unlike anyone else. She can encourage or deflate him unlike anyone else. And so that's part of building up a house. There's a movie that I think I was kind of coming of age when it came out, but it was 300, right, with Gerard Butler, the Spartans. You've seen the movie, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But there's this perfect moment in this movie that I think illustrates this just perfectly, and how the power a wife has over her husband, and to kind of enliven the manliness in him, is that he's getting ready to go off to battle. It's hopeless. The war is imminent, and everything kind of seems lost. And he's looking at her, and he turns around, he walks away. All the soldiers are walking off in the distance, and he's the last one. And as he's walking away, she shouts out to him, "Spartan!" Right? And he, of course, he turns around and looks at her, and they walk closely again. And she takes off this pendant she's wearing, and she kind of wraps it around his neck as kind of a symbol of like, take me with you on this journey. And she says one thing, and he responds. He says, "Yes, my lady." And she says one thing to him that I think is just perfect. She says, come back. She says, come back with your shield or on it. In other words, go and fight well. I'm giving you permission to do what you know you need to do the hard thing. And yes, I love you. I'm going with you, but come back with your shield or on it. Basically, fight the fight you need to fight. And it's giving him permission to face the war, to face the battle, he has her vote of confidence in that fight. And so I think that's a very unique power that the wife has over a husband. And it's enlivening because husbands, I think, are wired to go and die for something that's worth dying for, right? Like, and now take that idea and read Romans 12:1, right? I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Now, think of a wife who is now saying to her Christian husband, bring back your shield or come back on it. Like, basically, go, die, be a living sacrifice unto God to be used by him. You're giving him permission to die to himself, to die to sin, to die to all those things in the name of fighting the fight that's worth dying in. And that's the fight for our sanctification, for our righteousness. So again, it all flows from that personal communion with God, flows into the relationships of the wife, the first relationship being that of her, between her and her husband. And the next one is most obviously is her children, right? Because in the Eastern culture, that went without saying, if you have a husband and a wife, you have a household, you're going to have children almost immediately, So, of course, so much can be said, but I think the thing I want to really focus in is this major theme of letting the goodness of God's grace, again, from that first point, govern even those relationships with your children. So here's a really practical example. Do you guys have kids? I don't know if you have kids or not.
Yeah, we have a 6-year-old daughter and a 5-year-old son.
That's awesome. That was rapid succession there.
Yeah, it was 13 months.
Wow, almost Irish twins, as they say.
Almost.
Yeah, so you know as well as we do then that it's very easy to discipline from a place of pragmatism, right? You just want them to be quiet, right? So you just want them to stop whining. You just want them to stop crying. You just want them to comply so you can get on with whatever it is you were doing. And that discipline from a place of pragmatism is always going to be rooted in a sense of self-urgency, self-desperation. But I would encourage, I think, given number one, discipline comes from a place of godly principle instead of pragmatism, right? Where we know, okay, I'm not going to just do the thing to get my kid to be quiet, but instead I'm going to recognize this as a moment of glad discipline. And discipline isn't just, whatever the end consequences. Discipline is teaching them, training. This is wrong. This is right. This is wrong. This is how you handled that wrong, or how you handled that well, and ushering them through that and with a glad kind of timbre to it, a glad tone to it, and a consistency, with clarity, with warmth, with clarity and certainty of conviction, as opposed to kind of the reactionary, emotionally driven, and even doubt infused discipline that comes from a place of self-striving, right? So it starts with the Lord. You can discipline and love your children, and correct them and disciple them from a place of glad stewardship. And then finally, so comes from this identifying God for who he is and your place as one of his, and then your relationship with the husband, relationship with the children, and the relationship with the household itself. Right? I think women are uniquely wired, uniquely equipped to make a home in ways that men aren't. And they can create a place of flourishing, or they can create a culture that's marked by complaining or pettiness or discontentment. Or they can create a culture that's rooted in, not in circumstance, but in the goodness and graciousness of God. And that from there, they can build up their house more consistently and from a place of confidence. So those are the first things that came to mind. I have, some more thoughts, but I think in most cultures, we can see that there is a correlative relationship between the privilege and responsibility of bearing and rearing children that makes women and mothers especially suited to create the culture of a home. And so, yeah.
You're right. And you struck a chord with me on several of those points. And the first one was really the access that a wife has to the heartstrings of a husband. And I've told my wife many times that I just want her to think I'm cool, like praise from other people. It means a lot, but nothing really means as much as praise from my wife. I feel like
Amen.
it's like a totally different level it's a totally different feeling when your wife encourages you and supports you and makes you feel like you're cool. As long as she thinks that. And then the other thing with your children, it's so easy, like you said, to just discipline out of emotion, or you just like, it's just been a long day and your kids are crying and screaming and fighting about who knows what, and you just discipline out of emotion instead of using that as a moment to build them up.
Yeah.
And so my wife is just the best at creating that environment, like that last point you were making, of nurturing and using moments to sort of bring peace and use it as a teachable moment. And that's what I love so much about my wife.
I love it.
So,
I love it. And our wives are uniquely suited for that, right? They can create a culture. Of course, it takes two. Of course, there's a lot to it, but generally speaking, they have a unique ability to do exactly that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, listen, for any Bibledingers viewers who don't know much about Fierce Marriage until today, where can they find out more about what you guys have?
Yeah, you can find us on all the socials. You can go to fiercemarriage.com, fierceparenting.com, and you'll find lots of resources there. We have ebooks, we have physical books, we have online courses. So Google is your friend, and you can find us.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right, man. Well, thank you so much for doing another part 2 to this series.